In another video, I looked at how to set up Capture One on an ultra-wide monitor, but obviously a lot of the time I'm also using a laptop, and here I've got kind of a different setup because the screen size is just a lot smaller and doesn't have the same aspect ratio. So I'll talk through this, and in particular, if you're coming from Lightroom, I'll talk a little bit about how I've got things set up, because I'm also a former Lightroom user and I've tried to take some of the things I liked about that and make Capture One behave that way. So in terms of the overall layout, I've got a column of thumbnails over on the left, and then I've got my tools over on the right hand side, and then the main working image in the middle. That's basically the reverse of how Capture One by default has it. We can actually go up and see what the default of Capture One looks like. If you go up into Window, Workspace, you'll see a list of the default workspaces. And then if you've saved ones yourself, then you'll see that list there as well. So if we go to default, you'll see that Capture One is kind of flip-flopped these, so that the thumbnails now are on the right and the tools are on the left. Coming from Lightroom, I just find it more natural now to have the tools over on the right-hand side, and so I have things reversed. And so I'll just go back to that again. So with this single column over on the left, that's good if I've got kind of a smaller set of images that if I'm working with. But if I want to see a larger collection or see all my images, then obviously it's not very useful to look at it that way. So you can hide and show the main working image and reveal the larger grid of icons or of thumbnails. For those of you coming from Lightroom, this would be like using the G key to toggle between the grid and the working image. Capture One works a little bit differently. It doesn't have quite that same concept, and so I've sort of kludged it to make it work in a similar kind of way, because I actually quite like that approach. And so there's just a keyboard shortcut to toggle between the two. By default, it's Control-Alt-V, which is just a little bit cumbersome, so I've just customized it to be Alt-V, and so that lets me toggle between those two. You can also turn this view of the thumbnails off entirely if you want. You can just hide it. And then likewise with the tools, Control-T will hide and show those tools. So if you want to get a little bit more room, you can do that. You can also flip the location of these, so you can move the thumbnails down into a horizontal view. So it sort of acts like a film strip. Now, by default, it's going to stay in the same grid view, which isn't very helpful. There's also a list view. If you look down here at these controls, there's a list view. Again, not very helpful here. It's more helpful if you've got the main image hidden. But for our purposes here, what we want is the film strip mode. And so that allows you to have just a single view. I like to have it over on the left, because I'm not squishing the height of the image that way. Just maximizes the size of the main working image. And then likewise with the tools, if you want those over on the left, it's Control-Shift-T to flip-flop those two things. That's the default shortcut. So turning to the tabs in the tools themselves, I've done a fair bit of customization here. Again, some of it just because I'm coming from Lightroom, and then other things just because there was stuff that I don't really use, and so I've removed it. One of the nice things about Capture One is that it's very customizable in terms of the user interface. On the downside, that can make it a little bit daunting because there's a lot of flexibility and options that you have. So it can be a little bit trickier to get up and running with, but hopefully once you get it set up, then it'll work well for your workflow. Here I've got 11 tabs, and so those each represent different modes of working on an image. So adjusting the exposure, adjusting the color, doing things with the details, processing the images, and so on. There's another YouTuber, Andy Mumford, who has really great videos, and he's done a tutorial on setting up Capture One for people coming from Lightroom, and what he did was he kind of recreated Lightroom's stack of tools pretty much verbatim over on the right hand side. I actually tried that initially as well, but I found that it was less efficient for whatever reason than actually sticking with having these different modes. And so I've now adapted to this this approach to doing things. And so the way I've got things set up is there's the file menu here, which contains your library and your own collections of things, and then I have this quick menu, and the idea of a quick menu is actually one of the options that is available by default in Capture One, though it's not actually a tab that appears by default. You have to turn it on, and the way that you make adjustments to these tabs in terms of which ones are there or which ones are not is if you right click in this area here, you can say add tool tab, and then you'll see the sort of the stock options that are available. So for example, capture, which is used for tethering, I don't do tethering, and so I just turn that one off. And then you can see the quick menu here. I have that one turned on. And then the other one the other sort of stock version that I have that is not on by default, which I did turn on, is black and white, and I'll show you that one in a second. You can then also remove any of these tabs, and you can remove individual tools from any of these tabs. So if you say, okay, within the quick menu, I actually don't want the keywords anymore, you can just remove that from this particular tab. So I'll come back to the quick menu in a second. I'll just keep going through the tour of these. I've got everything collapsed here just to make it easier for you to see what I've got in each of the different sections. Normally, obviously, these are expanded. I don't keep everything collapsed. So next over from the quick menu is exposure. So you've got your histogram, working with your basic exposure, highlights and shadows, which Capture One calls high dynamic range, levels, curves, clarity vignetting. Then next is the color, where you can adjust your white balance. There's more layers stuff here. Layers appear on most of these tabs because there's something that really applies across all of the different ones. Color balance, one of the great things about Capture One is how good it is at working with color and doing color grading. Then there's the black and white tab that I mentioned. It actually just brings together tools that are available elsewhere, in particular in the color. But by default, there is actually a black and white tool within the color one. But I definitely find it useful to have all of these available within one tab. So if I'm working intensively on an image in black and white, or if I'm doing a whole session of black and white, it's useful just to be able to kind of stay within this tool tab and not have to bounce back and forth between two or three different tabs. Then next I've got the details tab, which I rarely use. I'll just have sort of default sharpening stuff set up, and that's about all I normally use it for, unless I want to go in and tweak some noise reduction. Spot removal, you can get to from up here with this little circle here is the spot function. Then there is the lens tab, which I almost never go into. The rotation and the crop and keystoning are also all available up here and from keyboard commands. I just keep it around because I do occasionally need to do something with purple fringing. Next over is styles and presets and the adjustments clipboard, where you can access all of the different styles that you've got loaded in, and make adjustments to the what's being copied over when you're doing when you're copy pasting adjustments between different images. Then we've got the information tab, where you've got keywords, metadata, etc. And then the two develop-related tabs. So there's the one for actually setting up what are you going to use to process a particular image, and then the queue and the history of which images are coming up for processing or which have been processed. Okay, so just coming back to the quick menu that I mentioned earlier. So this is a stock menu that Capture One makes available, though, as I mentioned, is not turned on by default when you first install the program. but I do quite like it, and in some ways it mimics the set of tools that were available when you had the grid of thumbnails visible in Lightroom, though to be honest I never really used that because I found it functionally just a bit too limiting, and the different interface for the controlling exposure and contrast and so on just never really worked for me. Whereas here I've got the exact same controls, it's just a subset really of what is in the exposure tool tab in my case. You can put anything in here that you want. I've also added in the keywords one, and the way that I use this is when I'm doing an initial triage of images, and I've kind of weeded out all the ones initially that I don't think are going to work, and now I'm down to the ones that I think look promising, but I want to go through and do some initial edits on them just to make sure that they're okay without getting too into the weeds with everything else that I can do further down the line. So this just lets me kind of rough some things in and just make sure everything is looking okay before going any further. So it's just a very focused set of tools. This is how I use it. You obviously can do whatever you want. Sometimes I'll need to adjust the white balance. And then obviously there's all the basic exposure tools here, the highlight and shadow controls, clarity. So those are the ones that I have it set up for. So I just find it a useful first step to kind of rough things in, the kind of the major aspects of the image before you go in and do any fine tuning. So those are the tabs that I've got, and you can just click through them as I've been doing here. You can also do Control Tab to move between them, and Control Shift Tab to move backwards. So in that respect, it actually works. If you use the Chrome browser, for example, it's the exact same keyboard commands for moving between tabs in the Chrome browser as it is here. And then actually the same as in the Chrome browser, if you do Control 1, Control 2, Control 3, it will move to the tabs at those positions. So first, second, third, fourth, so whatever tab or set of functions is at that position, it will move to that position. Generally, to be honest, I just use the mouse because I find that it's just as quick, but some people definitely prefer doing things with the keyboard. So then once you've got things set up the way you want, then you can go in and save the workspace, give it a name, and then it'll save to a folder location, which you can see here on the screen, at least for PC. I'm not entirely sure what it is for a Mac, to be honest. But once it's there, then at least what I do is I then copy it over to another folder that is synced through the cloud, and then I can just pull it over onto my other machine that I also use Capture One on, and that way the workspaces or the keyboard commands in particular are kept in sync with one another. So hopefully that's been a little bit helpful at thinking through how to set up the workspace and some of the tool tabs.